In the spring of 1871, a land surveyor named Eli Banner walked the Newton property alone, dragging a crooked wheel through the brittle soil. The orchard had once been famous for its reds and golds, apples so sweet that school children skipped church to steal them. But now, not a single tree stood alive. The trunks that remained were hollow and gray, slumping like sick men who knew they'd been forgotten. No birds sang in the branches, no insects buzzed in the soil. Eli kneeled to test the ground with his hand and found it oddly cold. Dry near the surface, but soft beneath like wet silk. He pushed his fingers deeper until the tip of one touched something that didn't give. It wasn't stone. It wasn't wood. It felt like wax. He stood quickly, said nothing, and marked the area as unsuitable for planting. He never returned. The Newton estate had passed through 3 owners since the family vanished. None had stayed long. A widow from Pennsylvania lasted 6 months before claiming she heard weeping in the root cellar. A preacher tried to build a retreat for recovering veterans but abandoned the plan after finding child-sized depressions in the orchard soil lined in brick. Officially, the county listed the land as sterile due to mineral leaching. Unofficially, locals called it the Dead Orchard. What the county didn't publish was that in 1860, 14 burial plots had been dug by order of the town council after reports of missing children finally reached the state coroner. 14 caskets were placed in the orchard under the cover of night, overseen by Reverend Boone and 2 mute farmhands. The coffins were sealed, lowered, and blessed, but not one contained a human body. Each was filled with wax. Not candle wax, but sculpted figures, each the size of a child, molded with exquisite care, clothed in Sunday fabric and painted with thin, chilling precision. One coffin contained a wax girl whose knees were bent the wrong way as though she'd been folded for storage. Another bore the faint scent of milk and almonds, her hands cupped around a hollow cavity in her chest. All had hair that appeared real, some even matched samples from missing children reports. But there were no organs, no bone, no breath. Just wax, silk, and silence. No charges were filed. The coroner sealed his report with red twine and left town the next week. Locals whispered that Reverend Boone aged 10 years that night. He resigned the following month, his sermons reduced to mumbles. He said only this before leaving: they were beautiful, but they were wrong. The orchard was sold for pennies. Trees refused to take root. Seeds rotted in their holes. When one boy dared to dig beneath the oldest tree stump, he found not worms or beetles, but a small porcelain eye staring upward. His mother burned his clothes and refused to let him speak of it again. Decades passed, and the orchard stood as a hushed scar on the edge of town, barren, gray, and cold in every season. Botanists called it a dead zone, but those who knew the Newton name never called it anything at all. What had grown there once wasn't fruit. It was silence, shaped, painted, and buried in the likeness of what was lost. And whatever remained in the soil now, it didn't want to bloom. It wanted to be forgotten. But the land would not stay quiet forever. In the autumn of 1835, Joseph Newton arrived in Montgomery County with a wagon of brushes, 3 crates of lamp oil, and a wife who seldom looked out the window. They settled just beyond the edge of Dayton, where the town gave way to field and orchard. Joseph claimed the land had the right kind of quiet for his work. He said he painted people the way God might see them, without their noise. Within weeks, he'd become a fixture in the county. He offered discounted portraits to veterans, free miniatures for grieving widows, and spent Sunday afternoons at church sketching parishioners for practice. He was polite, soft-spoken, fond of honey in his tea and long silences at supper. He wore linen even in the cold and insisted on candles, never lamps, claiming firelight made the skin more honest. The Newton home was modest but well kept. A piano sat near the window, always clean though no one ever saw it played. His 5 children were pale, tidy, and quiet. The older ones helped with deliveries, their sleeves rolled high enough to show arms that bore no bruises, no scrapes, no proof of play. The youngest rarely spoke at all. Joseph said they were raised gentle, and no one questioned it. In a town still recovering from loss and illness, silence was seen as virtuous. And so, when the Newton parlor began to fill with lifelike wax figures, seated girls in blue, boys posed with books or satchels, women in shawls with glassy stares, no one protested. Joseph said it was part of his study. He called them still portraits and claimed they helped him preserve expressions too fleeting for paint. Visitors admired them without knowing why they shivered after. One mother swore a wax boy blinked. A child claimed one figure's finger twitched when she got too close, but Joseph smiled and dismissed it all. The mind, he said, will find motion even in stillness. He welcomed guests with warm cider and gentle conversation, asking questions in soft tones about their habits, their children, the times they felt most afraid. His questions never seemed cruel, only curious. Some said he would stare too long at mouths when people spoke, as if memorizing the way lips folded over words. He never raised his voice. He never drank. He never seemed angry. What no one saw, what no one thought to look for, was the cellar. Behind the parlor wall, past a shelf of art books and dusty candles, a narrow door led to a room lined in wax. The air was thick, sweet, almost pleasant. On the far side stood a workbench covered in molds. Fingers, ears, full torsos with open chests. Small drawers held baby teeth sorted by size. Some still had threads attached. A row of tools lay neatly arranged. Not knives, but smooth-bladed instruments shaped like tongues, curved like ribs. Hanging from a wire near the ceiling were 6 faces in progress. They were not masks. They were casts, each pressed from a real face, soft and sagging at the edges, like the wax wanted to remember how it was touched. Joseph called this room the quiet room. Only his wife ever entered it, and only to deliver salt water or cloth. The children were told it was where Papa did his most sacred work. They were taught not to knock. If they heard crying, they were told it was the wax cooling. When the wind shifted and brought a scent like warm tallow and scorched hair, they closed the windows and said nothing. In town, Joseph Newton remained the portraitist, charming, precise, generous. But inside that house, silence was not just welcome. It was worshipped, and the wax, always warm, never truly hardened. In the deep of winter, 1836, a girl named Agnes Bell vanished on her way to her aunt's home just 3 fields from her own. She was 9 years old and wore a bonnet stitched by her older sister, a lace-trimmed cloak and woolen mittens with a flower embroidered into the palm. She had taken that path 100 times before. But that morning, after a snowfall so thick it hushed every sound beneath its weight, she simply didn't arrive. Her footprints trailed halfway through the second field before vanishing into churned soil and ice. A neighbor blamed a coyote. The constable blamed the cold. Her mother blamed herself and never touched a teacup again without sobbing into the rim. But Joseph Newton said nothing. When asked if he'd seen the girl, he shook his head slowly and said he preferred to paint indoors when the frost was loud. 3 days later, as the frost began to melt in thin cracks down the side of the Newton house, a new wax figure appeared in the parlor window. It was a girl, smaller than the others, seated on a velvet stool with her hands folded gently in her lap. She wore a pale lace dress, white boots with tiny buttons, and her bonnet was tied with a soft, uneven bow, as if by a child's hand. The face was smooth, too smooth. But her eyes, the eyes caught the light in a way that turned heads. Visitors remarked on the shimmer in her gaze, how the pupils looked wet, reflective, alive. Some said she looked just like Agnes, though no one dared say it aloud. The wax child remained in the window for weeks, a soft light always burning beside her at dusk. Joseph told a parishioner he'd created her in memory of lost innocence, and that she helped him reflect on stillness. When the snow melted and Agnes's trail was long buried, people stopped looking. Her name faded into winter, and the wax girl became part of the Newton home, unnamed, unmoving, always watching. One child said she dreamed of the figure whispering her name. Another refused to walk past the house, claiming the girl's mouth changed shape if you stared too long. Years passed. The wax child was moved deeper into the parlor, replaced by others, older, taller, more refined. Joseph's work grew more detailed, his commissions more sought after. But the little girl in the lace dress remained somewhere in the house, preserved and hidden. When Joseph died, the property changed hands quietly. The new owner cleared the cellar, dismantled the parlor, and burned most of the figures. Yet certain items refused to burn. Among them, found buried beneath a floorboard in the old workshop, was a child's bonnet, aged, stained with time, and still bearing the initials A.B. sewn into the lining. The lace had darkened, but the bow was still crooked. Pressed into the fabric was a faint outline of a hand, as if it had once been gripped tightly by someone small and terrified. For years, the bonnet was stored in a church chest alongside relics of unknown origin. But those who saw it said the threads felt warmer than they should, as if touched by breath. No one questioned how it ended up beneath the workshop. No one wanted to ask what had been molded there, or whose silence had been shaped into glassy eyes and a folded lap. The girl with the glassy face never left the house. Not really. She only learned how to stay still. In the quiet seasons between harvest and thaw, the Newton home became a place of whispered invitation for the neighborhood children. Parents, grateful for any distraction that kept restless minds from wandering into mischief, welcomed Joseph's offer of afternoon stillness lessons. He called them games at first, sitting still games, observation hours, molding sessions. The words changed depending on who he was speaking to, but the rules remained the same. No blinking, no talking, no shifting. Children were asked to hold a pose for as long as they could, chin up, hands resting neatly in their laps, eyes forward. Joseph said it was for training the body to obey the soul. That phrase appeared in his journals again and again. At first, the children giggled. They fidgeted, coughed, scratched. Joseph didn't scold. He smiled softly and took note. On his little notepad, he would sketch their outlines, quick impressions, and label them with single words like fidget, loose breath, or flutter. After 3 sessions, the pins were introduced. Not sharp enough to pierce deeply, but just enough to press against skin. A brass pin on the back of the hand if they twitched. One near the collar if they slouched. Sometimes a small coin was placed on the tongue, and they were told to keep it balanced. If the coin dropped, they failed. Joseph said it was a matter of beauty. Stillness was beauty, and beauty was the goal. Some children were praised for being mold-worthy. Others were quietly excluded after too many blinks, too many shifts, too much breathing. One girl, years later, would recall how Joseph leaned in close and whispered that she didn't breathe pretty enough for the mold. She remembered the way his fingers hovered near her cheek as if preparing to press it into something soft. She didn't go back. Her mother never asked why. The sessions always ended the same way. Joseph would walk behind the children slowly and tap the shoulder of one. That child would be taken into the back room for what he called a casting preview. The door would close. Sometimes they returned after several minutes, faces pale, lips tight, not speaking. Other times they didn't come back at all. Joseph told the others those children had graduated early or were perfect already. No one questioned this, not seriously. After all, the parents were receiving beautiful miniatures in the mail, little paintings of their children posed in angelic calm, eyes still and mouths gently closed. Each portrait came with a note praising the child's patience and discipline. But some of the children noticed things the adults didn't. One boy said the wax figures in the parlor wore the same clothes they'd once been given for Sunday school. A girl swore that one figure had the same chipped tooth as her missing cousin. Another claimed she saw her friend's braid, same red ribbon, same looped twist, tucked into a cabinet in Joseph's workshop. She never returned to the Newton house, and her family moved 2 towns over the following month. There were no screams in that parlor, no bruises, no blood. Just long silences, the creak of wood as chairs shifted under pressure, and the quiet sound of children learning to stop being children. Joseph taught them how to hold their breath, how to sit like wax, how to disappear without ever standing up. And long after the lessons ended, some still woke at night unable to move, afraid their breath would be found lacking. It was the heat that gave it away. That thick, muggy press of late summer in 1837 when the clay warped faster and the beeswax softened before it reached the kiln. Henry Aldrich, the town's only potter, had been working since dawn in the rear room of his shop when the crate arrived. One of several shipments marked art materials, fragile, handle warm. Joseph Newton had ordered from him before, but this delivery was different. The boxes were heavier, the wood damp and dark-streaked like something had wept through the grain. Henry noticed the smell before he saw the break. Something sour beneath the sweet tang of oil and wax. The kind of scent that clung to the inside of your nostrils and made you taste metal. He opened the cracked seam with a chisel and nearly dropped it when the corner split fully open. Inside was wax, yes, but not the kind sold in slabs. It was soft, pale, too flesh-colored. Suspended in the semi-melted mound was a length of something stringy and dark. At first, Henry thought it was horsehair, but as he tugged gently, the strands curled at the ends and came free in a small clump, root bulbs still attached. Human. Beneath it, nestled in a sliver of congealed yellow, was something smooth and white. When Henry tapped it loose, it rolled in his palm, small, triangular, hollowed in the center. A jawbone, child-sized. He said nothing for the rest of the day, just sat at his bench, hands idle, pretending the smell wasn't turning his stomach. By dusk, he'd taken the crate to the constable's office and demanded an inspection. The constable, Sheriff Alton Beamer, was a tired man with weak eyes and a tendency to favor the word coincidence. He opened the box, flinched once, then reached for a rag. "Animal remains," he muttered. "It's not uncommon. Whale oil's full of scraps if you buy cheap." But Henry had seen many animals in his line of work, and none bore the clean, tiny rows of a child's teeth. He said as much. The sheriff raised an eyebrow and told him to go home and have something strong to drink. The next day, Joseph arrived at the sheriff's office with a wrapped package. Witnesses said he looked composed, even warm. Said he brought a portrait, freshly painted, still smelling of linseed and wax. It was the sheriff's wife, young and beaming, her face lit from the left as if kissed by God. Sheriff Beamer hung the portrait in his home the same night. By morning, the crate was gone. The report was never filed. Henry never saw the jawbone again. For a week afterward, Henry Aldrich kept his shop closed and slept with a pistol under his pillow. He burned the shirt he'd worn that day, but the smell never quite left the back of his throat. He stopped accepting orders from Joseph, claiming he was too busy with kiln repairs. Joseph didn't seem to mind. He found another supplier across the river and shipments resumed without delay. But from that summer on, neighbors whispered that something in Joseph's wax had changed. The color deepened, The texture hardened just slightly, and the figures' mouths, once delicately closed, began to part ever so slightly, as if something inside wanted out. People passed the Newton house with quicker steps after that, not because of what they saw, but because of what they sometimes smelled when the wind blew just right. A scent not strong, not obvious, but unmistakable to those who'd ever been near a sickbed at the end. Wax, oil, and something beneath it, something that once had breath. In 1919, during the demolition of a long-abandoned general store on the outskirts of Dayton, a ledger was discovered behind a false wall. The binding was cracked, soaked in oil along the spine, and the pages curled at the edges with age and heat damage. At first glance, it appeared to be the journal of a tradesman, possibly a supplier of candles and wax goods. But as archivists from the county examined the entries more closely, the pattern began to unnerve. There were no customer names, only vague codes and detailed dimensions. Every order was for molded wax, but not the usual tapers or ceremonial figures. These were exacting specifications for pieces of the human form. A page dated June 1836 listed 6 left arms, ages 8 to 10, 4 small hands, girl, 3 partial feet, damaged molds, 1 full torso, smoothed, silent batch. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. Measurements were recorded down to the half-inch. Notes were added after each shipment. Fingers too soft on reheat, or re-pour thumbs with bone wire. Some orders were repeated multiple times with minor variations, suggesting the work wasn't decorative but exacting, ritualistic. Several entries were marked with single initials, R, M, E, and beside them remarks such as skin texture passable, or eye recess too deep for accurate placement. One order simply read, Rebecca model no longer viable, extracted again. Elbows too stiff this batch. Investigators believed the ledger belonged to a candleworks dealer named Horace Flint, long dead by then, who had quietly supplied wax and materials to rural craftsmen. Horace had no storefront. His goods were ordered through handwritten letters and delivered by cart. He was known to be discreet, private, and specialized in high-end wax for medical demonstrations and artistic moldings. What hadn't been known until the ledger surfaced was how many of his shipments were tailored for a single client under the abbreviation JN. These JN entries were the most frequent, spanning nearly 7 years. Each order listed not only wax quantities but also additives: bone ash, crushed chalk, sea salt, and blood lye. The final ingredient was underlined twice, followed by the note, preheated to match skin temperature before setting. The journal offered no commentary, no ethical musings, no alarm. Just method, procedure, precision. The most disturbing section was found near the end of the ledger, a page torn halfway through with only fragments remaining. It included rough sketches of children's limbs marked with dotted lines, as if for cutting or posing. One diagram labeled mouth mold showed a crude wax cast split down the middle and hollowed within. The annotation read, "Breathe cavity not needed in final model. Seal shut after pose fixed. Fill with lye paste if curling resins." Archivists traced the handwriting and confirmed its match with receipts found in the Newton household ruins, linking the ledger to repeated shipments of wax, salt, and bone thread materials. But nothing in the journal referenced full figures, only parts, molds, batches. It wasn't sculpture, it was something else, a process of replication that suggested not art, but replacement. Not beauty, but control. The wax figures in the Newton home had always appeared too real. Now, with the ledger in hand, it became clear why. They weren't imitations, they were reconstructions. Molds made from something that once had breath, pose, weight. And for Joseph Newton, the wax room was not a studio. It was a factory, where silence was poured, shaped, and set. Not one child had ever come out of that room unchanged, and some, it seemed, had never come out at all. The Newton house had been empty for decades by the time a mason named Cyril Wexley was hired to dismantle the hearth in 1910. The structure had begun to crumble inward, the mortar flaking like dead skin, the iron grate rusted stiff. What remained of the estate had been sold to the county in parts, first the orchard, then the workshop, and finally the house itself, its upper floors sagging under the weight of rot and memory. Cyril had worked through the morning without issue, prying brick from brick, tossing them into neat stacks by the door. But around noon, when he struck a certain seam behind the hearthstone, the chisel clanged differently, hollow. He paused, tapped again, then slowly began to clear the surrounding mortar. What he uncovered was a deliberate cavity, neatly bricked, arched at the top, sealed tight with a layer of plaster. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. Inside was a jar, not a decorative one, not a keepsake. It was wide, thick-glassed, sealed in wax, and cloudy with a murky solution the color of old tea. Floating within were two long, pale cords, twisted like ribbon and curled at the ends. They looked soft, spongy, almost tender. Suspended in liquid, they swayed gently with each movement of the jar. Cyril lifted it with shaking hands and held it to the light, where he noticed the faded label pressed beneath the wax. One word scratched in fine cursive, EST. At first, no one understood what it meant. The newspaper described it as an anatomical curiosity. The county clerk filed it under miscellaneous biological specimen. But a week later, a librarian named Hattie Warren, who had grown up in the township, wrote a quiet letter to the Historical Society. She remembered the Newton family. She remembered the 5 children, 4 of whom had been seen regularly in town. The 5th, Esther, had disappeared from memory sometime around 1840. Locals had assumed she'd been sent to boarding school or married off early. But there was never a wedding, never a return, and no one ever recalled receiving a letter from her. Hattie's note ended with a single sentence. I believe Esther was the middle child. The jar was sent to the State University, where a faculty surgeon confirmed the contents were vocal cords, human, female, preserved in a method used briefly in the mid-19th century, involving salt brine and alcohol. The tissue was well maintained, unnaturally so. The cords bore small punctures along the top, as if they had once been stitched to tension. This wasn't medical preparation, it was deliberate silencing. In the following months, a search of remaining Newton estate records turned up a fragment of a journal, written in Lenora Newton's hand, Joseph's wife. Most of the pages were lost to mildew and time, but one remained legible. It read, "She cried too much. He said the voice had to go. Afterward, he cradled her as if it was love. He said stillness begins with the throat." There were no burial records for Esther, no letters, no trace of tuition payments to any school. Only the jar behind the hearth, sealed in stone like a relic meant to be hidden from heaven. And though no bones were found in the cavity, the air around it was colder than the rest of the house, the walls damp with something that didn't dry. Those who visited the site afterward said the parlor grew quiet when you entered it, as if sound itself bent away. They claimed the room swallowed voices that no echo ever came back. The children who trespassed dared each other to speak her name aloud. None of them could, not fully. It was as if the name itself had been carved out of the world. Esther Newton was never spoken of again. But her silence remained, preserved, suspended, floating in a jar no one wanted to open. It wasn't until the spring of 1872, nearly a year after Joseph Newton's death from a sudden and unexamined illness, that the town made any effort to unearth what had been buried beneath his orchard. Rumors had grown thick as moss over the years. Missing children, lifelike figures in windows, the hush that followed any mention of the Newton name. But until his death, no one had dared act. Joseph was too revered, too feared, too perfectly polite. He'd painted half the county's likenesses, donated quietly to the church, and never once raised his voice in public. But death loosened the grip. Whispers became questions, questions became demands, and finally a motion was passed to exhume one grave, just one, from the plot behind the house. They chose the smallest marker, a headstone no taller than a child's ribcage, etched with nothing more than the word Clara. No birth date, no scripture, just a name. The local doctor, a reluctant man named Silas Trummond, oversaw the opening. It was just after dawn when the coffin lid was pried open, revealing what first appeared to be a perfectly preserved child. She lay on a satin cushion dressed in ivory lace, arms folded, lips pale and pressed together. Her eyes were closed, her skin smooth, too smooth. The onlookers leaned in, and that's when Dr. Trummond noticed the seams. Along the neck, beneath the lace collar, ran a thin, near-invisible line where wax had been poured in two parts, fused and smoothed to resemble flesh. A delicate error in the fold of the ear revealed what lay beneath the paint, beeswax and chalk dust. But the hair was real, fine, auburn strands rooted into the scalp with surgical precision. Real hair on a wax body. Trummond's hands began to tremble. He reached for the figure's jaw and gently lifted. The entire head came free with a soft tug. It was hollow. Inside, a mesh of wire and stuffing, nothing human. But beneath the figure, pressed flat against the bottom of the coffin, was something else entirely. The real body, a girl's skeleton curled into a fetal position, ribs collapsed inward, limbs bound at the wrists with twine that had long since rotted to threads. Her spine had been broken once, maybe twice, but it was the skull that made Dr. Trummond drop his lantern. The jaw had been wired shut with copper thread. The teeth were gone, every single one. The sockets were smooth, polished as if scrubbed clean. The tongue had been removed entirely, the space behind the lower jaw carved out and filled with what looked like candle filler. Resin and salt packed tight into the void. And there, nestled where a voice once lived, was a cloth tag stitched with a single letter, C. The church bell rang 5 times that evening, not for mourning but warning. The coffin was resealed and hidden. Official reports were vague. Anomalous remains, non-standard embalming. No names were listed, no charges filed. The town council held a closed meeting the following week and voted unanimously to halt further exhumations. Clara's grave was never marked again. Years later, when the orchard was raised, nothing would grow where that coffin had been. Children claimed the ground hummed if you put your ear to it, like bees trapped in dirt. And those who lived long enough to remember said they never heard birdsong in that part of the field again. Just stillness, and when the wind came, it carried something faint and sour. The scent of wax and the bitter copper of old silence. No one ever found her voice, but everyone felt the absence of it. It hung in the trees, clung to the soil, and waited beneath the orchard for someone to ask why a child needed to be replaced with a doll. Why her mouth was sewn shut. Why silence had been molded to look so holy. It wasn't until the spring of 1872, nearly a year after Joseph Newton's death from a sudden and unexamined illness, that the town made any effort to unearth what had been buried beneath his orchard. Rumors had grown thick as moss over the years. Missing children, lifelike figures in windows, the hush that followed any mention of the Newton name. But until his death, no one had dared act. Joseph was too revered, too feared, too perfectly polite. He'd painted half the county's likenesses, donated quietly to the church, and never once raised his voice in public. But death loosened the grip. Whispers became questions, questions became demands, and finally a motion was passed to exhume one grave, just one, from the plot behind the house. They chose the smallest marker, a headstone no taller than a child's ribcage, etched with nothing more than the word Clara. No birth date, no scripture, just a name. The local doctor, a reluctant man named Silas Trummond, oversaw the opening. It was just after dawn when the coffin lid was pried open, revealing what first appeared to be a perfectly preserved child. She lay on a satin cushion dressed in ivory lace, arms folded, lips pale and pressed together. Her eyes were closed, her skin smooth. Too smooth. The onlookers leaned in, and that's when Dr. Trummond noticed the seams. Along the neck, beneath the lace collar, ran a thin, near-invisible line, where wax had been poured in two parts, fused and smoothed to resemble flesh. A delicate error in the fold of the ear revealed what lay beneath the paint, beeswax and chalk dust. But the hair was real, fine, auburn strands rooted into the scalp with surgical precision. Real hair on a wax body. Trummond's hands began to tremble. He reached for the figure's jaw and gently lifted. The entire head came free with a soft tug. It was hollow. Inside, a mesh of wire and stuffing. Nothing human. But beneath the figure, pressed flat against the bottom of the coffin, was something else entirely. The real body. A girl's skeleton curled into a fetal position, ribs collapsed inward, limbs bound at the wrists with twine that had long since rotted to threads. Her spine had been broken once, maybe twice. But it was the skull that made Dr. Trummond drop his lantern. The jaw had been wired shut with copper thread. The teeth were gone, every single one. The sockets were smooth, polished as if scrubbed clean. The tongue had been removed entirely, the space behind the lower jaw carved out and filled with what looked like candle filler, resin and salt packed tight into the void. And there, nestled where a voice once lived, was a cloth tag stitched with a single letter, C. The church bell rang 5 times that evening, not for mourning but warning. The coffin was resealed and hidden. Official reports were vague, anomalous remains, non-standard embalming. No names were listed, no charges filed. The town council held a closed meeting the following week and voted unanimously to halt further exhumations. Clara's grave was never marked again. Years later, when the orchard was raised, nothing would grow where that coffin had been. Children claimed the ground hummed if you put your ear to it, like bees trapped in dirt. And those who lived long enough to remember said they never heard birdsong in that part of the field again. Just stillness. And when the wind came, it carried something faint and sour, the scent of wax and the bitter copper of old silence. No one ever found her voice, but everyone felt the absence of it. It hung in the trees, clung to the soil, and waited beneath the orchard for someone to ask why a child needed to be replaced with a doll, why her mouth was sewn shut, why silence had been molded to look so holy. Lenora Newton had always been seen as the gentler shadow behind her husband's brilliance, a soft-voiced woman with hands folded neatly in her lap, rarely seen in town except for Sunday service and the occasional delivery of lemon cakes to the pastor's wife. She sang in church, never too loud, always half a note beneath the melody. And when she sang, people described it as calming, like hearing wind through reeds. But decades later, when her private belongings were unearthed from a locked cedar trunk hidden beneath the master bed, the music Lenora kept for herself told a different story. Inside the trunk were 3 hymn books, identical on the outside, worn from handling, their leather spines cracked and softened. But each page had been carefully altered. Traditional verses praising grace, mercy, and salvation had been scraped away with a blade and replaced with delicate ink strokes in Lenora's soft cursive. The changes weren't violent, but surgical, intentional rewrites that turned worship into something colder, more obedient. Blessed be the waxen lamb, still of hand and sealed of breath. Perfect is the mouth that waits, and lovely is the child in death. Another hymn, once about the peace of evening, now read, when silence binds the tongue with thread, and eyes no longer blink or plead, the Lord is nearer than the sound, and motion is a kind of need. There were dozens of verses like this, poems of stillness, praise for silence, refrains about quiet hands and folded bodies. They weren't songs anymore, they were instructions, rituals. Affirmations of a world where movement meant failure and sound was a flaw. She didn't write about her husband directly, not in the hymns. But between the pages, tucked into the margins or slipped between the leaves, were fragments of letters never mailed. They were addressed to a Miss Irene, no last name, no return address, and they told a story more chilling than any wax figure ever could. In one, Lenora wrote, "He calls it sculpting, but it is shaping God's image to fit his own quiet. He says the Lord turned Lot's wife to salt not for looking, but for crying out. He says the wax listens better than the children do." Another, barely legible, said, "Sometimes at night I swear the eyes move, not his, the others. They shine when I light the lamp. They don't blink, but they glisten. They glisten and glisten and glisten." The last entry was dated 2 weeks before Joseph's death. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in the dark or with trembling hands. "He says they won't melt this time. He used salt instead of chalk." He sang to them as he poured the last layer. "He says they're clean now, all clean. He says I should sing too." There was no record of Lenora's death, no grave, no obituary, just silence. Some believed she left in the night. Others said she was buried beneath the piano. A few whispered she became one of them, preserved in lace and wax, set in the corner of the parlor where guests no longer looked too closely. But her hymns remained, hidden, brittle, humming with a kind of broken reverence. They were not prayers, they were surrender, songs to soothe the sick quiet that had wrapped itself around that house like a second skin. And though no one ever heard her voice again, her silence, crafted, rewritten, sung with eyes wide and mouth closed, would echo through the orchard long after the wax began to crack. Strasbourg Mary's orphan home stood 2 miles outside Dayton, near the bend of a quiet river where the fog lingered longer than it should. The stone building had once been a place of refuge, a haven for war widows and unwanted children, but by the 1840s it had grown cold with discipline and silence. The nuns ran it with strict routines favoring obedience over affection, prayer over comfort. No one questioned it. Discipline was seen as mercy back then, and when Joseph Newton began donating to the home, no one questioned that either. His generosity arrived in small, deliberate amounts, never enough to attract scrutiny, but steady enough to matter. Packages of blankets, jars of wax polish, sealed tins of powdered milk. Occasionally envelopes of folded cash marked "for the girls' quiet time." In return, the orphanage records, unearthed decades later in a crumbling attic file, showed something troubling. 4 names, 4 girls, ages 8 to 11, each listed with the same transfer note, sent to assist with candle making. No return date, no further mention. At the time, it was considered a kindness, giving the girls a task outside the harsh dormitories, offering them purpose in a respected artist's home. St. Mary's kept no photographs, but the quarterly logs mentioned gifts sent back. Small portraits, pressed ribbons, even a pair of wax hands wrapped in velvet cloth. One nun called them too detailed to be innocent. But her concern went no further. Those were years when children had no say, when stillness was virtue, and the silence of little girls was mistaken for peace. It wasn't until 1897 that a letter was found behind the false back of a chapel drawer, wedged beneath a cracked crucifix. It had never been sent. Penned by Sister Calvina, one of the few who remained at St. Mary's past the turn of the century, the ink had faded in places, but the message was unmistakable. "Your Grace," it began, "I write with urgency and trembling hand. The man, Mr. Newton, whom you praised for his support, has requested more girls for his workshop. He says they calm the wax, that their hands shape it best." But Sister Leone saw one return only briefly. Her lips had cracked open in a line across her cheek as though something inside had dried too quickly. She would not speak. Her breath came shallow, and when we undressed her, her chest bore a mark in chalk, an oval drawn with a line through it like a mouth sealed shut. He sent her back the next morning. Said she was too stiff for the mold. "I beg you, Your Grace, stop this practice. The children are softening." The letter ended there, unsigned. No response was ever found. No evidence it had even been read. What followed in the years after were quiet removals, sisters transferred, records misplaced, and by 1901 the names of the 4 girls, Annie, Ruth, Liza, and Marjorie, no longer appeared in any registry. They were never claimed, never buried. They simply dissolved into the folds of an institution that had learned to equate silence with order. Historians would later argue that the Church did not know, not fully, that it had been misled, deceived by the same charm and civility Joseph Newton used on the town. But the letter remained. So did the donations. So did the absence of 4 names in every census afterward. And those who studied the wax figures recovered from the Newton property noted that a few had traits not seen in local children. A freckle near the brow, a crooked toe, a mole on the collarbone. Features known only to the girls of St. Mary's. Features never born in Dayton but buried there all the same. The Church never offered explanation. It didn't need to. Its silence had already answered. The cellar of the Newton house had long been a place whispered about but rarely entered. By the time surveyors dared open its floorboards in 1889, the walls were already bowed with damp, the air heavy with the sweet, rancid smell of old oil. Beneath the warped planks wedged into the earth itself, they found a wooden chest bound with copper hinges. It took 3 men to hoist it up, the lid swollen tight with rot. When it finally split open, a smell like melted fat filled the air. What lay inside was neither entirely human nor entirely wax. It was something in between, an unfinished body, pale as candle drippings, slumped sideways as though waiting for its shape to be decided. The torso was intact but hollowed, a cavity running from throat to abdomen lined in layers of resin and salt. The limbs were uneven. One arm too long, the other half formed and flattened where the mold had failed. The face was a smear, only sockets pressed deep enough to suggest eyes. It was not a figure meant to be displayed. It was a work in progress, abandoned before completion. But alongside the wax body, tucked neatly in oil-stained paper, were notes written in Joseph Newton's narrow hand. Each page was filled with measurements, of rib cages, of shoulders, of the space between breaths. He had recorded how long a child could hold still before trembling, how many heartbeats passed between blinks, which posture held silence best. Beside these calculations were sketches, crude and disturbing, of half-formed molds positioned like puppets. The most chilling details, however, were not diagrams but numbers, scrawled in margins over and over in blackened ink. 14, 1 over 13, 13 perfect, 14 immortal. Scholars argued for decades over the meaning of the phrase. Some claimed it was religious numerology, 13 as the number of apostles after Judas, 14 as completion broken into sacrifice. Others saw it as arithmetic madness, a man convinced that by destroying one, he could preserve the rest forever. But those who knew the history of the Newton family whispered another possibility. There had been 5 children in the household. 4 were painted, seen, accounted for in memory. The fifth, Esther, had vanished. And in the cellar notes a figure labeled EST, incomplete, appeared again and again, always marked with corrections, always struck through. 14 attempts to mold her silence. 13 failures. The last body in the chest left unfinished. The equation may not have been about faith or philosophy at all. It may have been about replication. 14 molds to achieve one perfect stillness, 13 abandoned, cracked, or melted in failure. And the 14th, this figure in the chest, left waiting for its breath to be measured, its silence sealed. Whether Joseph ran out of time or whether the figure itself resisted completion, no one could say. But the notes ended abruptly with one final line. If the breath holds, she will not melt. The chest was reburied quietly. The town council feared what would follow if word spread, and so they sealed the cellar with stone and left it to collapse under its own weight. But those who handled the notes swore that even after a century the ink smudged fresh against their fingers as though written yesterday. And when the papers were stored in the county archive, guards claimed they could hear faint scratching at night, like the sound of a quill dragging across a page, repeating the same sum again and again. 14, 1, 13, 13 perfect, 14 immortal. In 1908, when the Newton story had already decayed into rumor and silence, a frail man named Elias Drow returned to Dayton to die. He was 93 years old, blind in one eye, his body bent as if folded too many times. He had worked most of his life as a traveling taxidermist, stuffing deer, preserving foxes, setting glass eyes into hunting trophies. Few paid him much mind, but before his final winter, Elias asked to speak with a priest. He said there were things he had carried in secret for too long. And in the last weeks of his life, his voice cracked open the silence that Joseph Newton had left behind. He said he had once been an apprentice in Joseph's home, a boy of 12 when his mother begged Newton to take him in. She thought it was an opportunity, a chance to learn a trade. Joseph welcomed him gently, telling him he had steady hands for small things. Elias expected to be trained in portraiture. Instead, he was led to the cellar where wax was not medium but sealant, and stillness was not art but command. Elias described in halting tones how the work was divided. Bodies, never spoken of as such, always forms, arrived in silence. He was told to wash the organs in salt until they stiffened, to hang lungs until they dried into leathery sacks, to rub livers with ash so the color would not turn. Once dried, the pieces were dipped into resin, sealed smooth, and set aside. Wax was poured not to create but to cover, to close, to disguise what had been taken apart. It was never sculpture, Elias said through tears. It was packaging. He recalled the first time Joseph let him place an eye, a child's, hazel, still wet with the cloud of death. Joseph guided his hand, told him to fit it into the wax socket, to press until it seemed to look alive again. But the eye slid crooked, rolling just enough to make the gaze unnatural. Elias tried again, pressing harder until the fragile sphere burst under his thumb. The fluid ran down the wax cheek. Elias sobbed, but Joseph only placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Stillness forgives nothing. Try again." He tried again, until his hands shook so violently he could not hold the glass replacements. He said he never forgot the way the socket smelled, salt, resin, and something sour beneath. He said every time the molds were sealed, he felt the air change in the cellar as though silence itself grew heavier, bending the room inward. He remembered Joseph humming during the work, not hymns from the church, but broken notes repeated again and again, as if keeping rhythm for a ritual no one else could hear. For decades, Elias told no one. He left the Newton home before manhood, carrying only his shame and the craft he'd been forced to learn. He used it on animals instead, never on people again. But he said he could never forget how wax felt against bone, how silence seemed to thicken when breath was gone. In his last confession, he clutched the priest's sleeve and whispered, "He wasn't preserving them. He was erasing them, covering what God made with something he could own. And when the eye wouldn't set right, I knew. It was because even death refused to look at him." Elias died 2 days later. His words, written down by the priest, were never formally archived. But the story lingered, passed quietly from ear to ear. And in every retelling, it ended the same way, with an image no one could shake, a child's face, smooth with wax, gazing upward with eyes that would never sit right, no matter how hard Joseph tried to make them stay still. By the turn of the century, the Newton name had become less a family memory and more a shadow cast over Montgomery County. Farmers spoke of the barren orchard, children dared each other to peer into the crumbling cellar windows, and the few who remembered firsthand carried their knowledge in silence. But silence could not keep what was buried from surfacing. County officials, archivists, and even journalists had begun piecing together fragments. Ledgers, altered hymnals, and testimony like Elias Drow's confession. The stories converged into something undeniable. There had been children unaccounted for, graves filled not with flesh but with wax, and a system of trust that had allowed it to persist. It was not merely Joseph Newton's evil that unsettled lawmakers. It was the realization that the institutions around him, the church, the sheriff, even grieving parents, had chosen not to look too closely. In 1904, the Ohio legislature convened to address growing concerns about improper burials. Reports from Dayton and surrounding counties revealed a troubling pattern. Graves sealed too quickly, coffins closed without inspection, death certificates signed on reputation rather than evidence. Behind the formal language of the proposal lay a single case study, never named directly but known to everyone present. The Newton family had taught them what happened when stillness was accepted at face value. Lawmakers called it the Burial Integrity Act, but locals, bitter and unflinching, gave it another name: the Newton Clause. The law required that every death, child or adult, be verified by 2 witnesses outside the family, and that a physician confirm the cause. No coffin could be lowered without the lid being opened at least once in front of a council clerk. For children, parish records had to list the manner of death in detail, not vague phrases like fever or consumption. If any body was absent, if anything about the remains seemed irregular, the burial was halted. Wax effigies, long popular in Victorian mourning culture, were explicitly outlawed for minors. Families could keep portraits or paintings, but not wax likenesses. The statute declared them a deception too easily abused. Historians often point to the Newton case as the quiet catalyst. Though never spoken of by name, the weight of his cellar, his figures, his jars, hung in the chamber like a ghost. Everyone knew why the law was needed. Too many had seen with their own eyes what happened when stillness was mistaken for peace. The debates were brief, the vote swift. Only one senator opposed, claiming the bill insulted family honor. His words were drowned out by the testimony of a mother who had buried 3 children and demanded to know how anyone could be certain what lay beneath their coffins. The law changed burial practices overnight. Clergymen accustomed to unquestioned authority now had to open coffins under public eyes. Families unused to paperwork were forced to sign affidavits. And though it brought outrage at first, in time it became ritual, a final moment when death had to be seen for what it was. To confirm there was a body, not a doll. To acknowledge breath had truly ended. To keep wax and silence from replacing flesh and voice again. In the years following, records improved. Orphans once sent away without trace were logged with care. the number of unmarked child graves declined. And though the Newtons were never named in statute, everyone who walked past the barren orchard knew who the law was for. It was for the children who had never been given the dignity of being buried as themselves. It was for the families who had accepted substitutes and kept their grief quiet. The Newton Clause did not bring justice. It could not undo the silence, but it left a mark all the same, etched not into wax, but into law. A reminder that stillness must always be tested, that a coffin is not a promise unless it holds what truth demands.